Third chapter in a day or a night. This one's going to be a long one. It's about 47 pages on my Kindle, so probably going to take me over an hour. Um, anyway, eating before doing this chapter. Sometimes it makes me drowsy, but I still feel like I'm going to be fairly sharp. So looking forward to it. This is one of my favorite chapters in the book, the insight into the culture and the people that you get through this exploration of their stories and mythology is really striking. So here we go. Chapter 17, Ghosts, Devils, and Spirits. It is time now to speak about the ghosts and devils who share the barrens with the people and the deer. For in the days which followed the discovery of the nameless lake, these things loomed large in our experiences. In the world of the Hamlet, the law governs both man's social and his spiritual life and applies with equal force not only to the absolute realities, but to the natural abstractions, to the abstractions of the supernatural. There is but one law for man and for the spectral entities whose name is Legion. These other beings are so numerous as to have such varied forms that the Alhamwood do not know them all by name or even by description, and they can hardly gauge the full potentialities of those they know. It follows, therefore, that a man must be exceedingly careful to observe the most trivial instructions of the law, which can alone protect him from both the known and the unknowable. It was through the fine mesh of the law of life that I saw and came to have a limited understanding of the hierarchy of the Baron's demi-world. Kakumi was my principal instructor, and he knew whereof he spoke, for he was closely in league with many ghosts. He showed no reluctance in discussing these things with me, nor did I encounter that reluctance among the people, perhaps because they have not yet heard that the beliefs are abhorrent to white men and must be hidden from us. At the peak of the hierarchy of spiritual beings stands those elemental forces of nature which have no concrete form. Um, at their head is Kaila, the god of weather and of the sky. Kaila is the creator and thus the paramount godhead of the people. He is aloof, as the mightiest deity should be, and man is no more than dust under his feet. He demands neither abasement nor worship from those he created. But Kaila is a just God, for he is all things brought about by the powers of nature, and nature, who is completely impartial, cannot be unjust. It is permissible to appeal to Kaila, yet there is no implicit belief that Kaila will hear or respond to prayers couched in the midge-like voices of men. This quality of impersonality, of detachment, in this god of the Hamlet strengthens the majesty of his power. Kaila is no simple creation of men's imagination, shackled to the whims and fancies of human minds. Kaila is, to the people, is an essence. Kaila is not spoken of with fear, nor yet of love. Kaila is. That is enough. What man may do or not do is no more direct concern to Kaila than the comings and goings of ants under moss. Kaila is not a moral force because the Ham would have no need of a spiritual magistrate to administer the moral law. Kaila is essential power. He is the wind over the plains. He is the sky and the flickering lights of the sky. Kaila is the power in running water and in the motion of falling snow. He is nothing. He is all things. For a second, I was struggling in the back of my mind while I was reading that to remember the frightening god in India in Hinduism with a similar name, and thinking about potential similarities, and it was Kali, the used as a villain in that Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, god of death and destruction. Surely there's no intentional connection in the names, just linguistically too unrelated and ethnically and historically too unrelated, but it did pop into my mind. The amorphous quality of Kyla makes it difficult for an outlander to understand the Helmut's real concept of their god, but the lesser deities associated with Kyla are more readily comprehensible. Of these, the most important are Hikinjuk, the sun, and Toktik, the moon. Both are real in the same sense that the world is real, and it has happened that shamans in trances have visited Toktik and found themselves in a land not unlike the Barrens. However, though they have a concrete existence, both Toktik and Hikinjuk exist also as primeval forces which are manifestations of Kyla. This dual concept allows for the parable of Heckenjuk being released from his imprisonment deep in the bowels of the earth by Amal the wolf. And this parable is no more difficult to reconcile with modern religious thought than is the parable of Adam and Eve. In fact, most of the spiritual beliefs dredged up by anthropologists from the folklore of native peoples are nothing more than parables. This point is worth remembering when we tend to pass superficial judgments on the religions of native races. The demi-world of spirits, ghosts, and devils is much easier to understand. These spirit beings are either devoted to the cause of good or evil or to an admixture of the two. For the sake of clarity, I have divided them into quite arbitrarily 3 groups. The first of these, the supernatural entities who devote themselves to evil, are fantastic and often horrible apparitions, which are in some ways no more than elaborations of the ultimate evil in man or the ultimate destructive power in animals. Those with a human form kill by human means, but those that resemble animals destroy by means of teeth or talons. Of these evil spirits, the foremost is Paija, an immense female devil. She is a giantess who has but a single leg springing from her generative organs, and who is clothed not in flowing black hair, only in flowing black hair. Hmm. Actually, let me try to read that a paragraph again. I thought I might do this more often, but I haven't really done more than tweak sentences. Of those evil spirits, the foremost is Paija, an immense female devil. She is a giantess who has but a single leg springing from her generative organs and who is clothed only in flowing black hair. Paija stalks abroad in the winter nights, and her single track is sometimes found in the new snow, an immense, twisted impression of a human foot. No man can tell you much of Paija except from hearsay, for to see Paija is to die with the sight of her frozen in the mind, forever beyond the reach of words. I once heard of a man called Jatu who lived near the Hudson Bay coast and who met Paija. One winter night he was coming home from his trap line, a blizzard blowing in his face. The swirling clouds of gray snow were like shadows seen by the light of a twisted, misted moon on a black night. Jatu had reached his igloo and was pulling up to a halt when those of his family who were inside the snow house heard him scream above the whine of the wind. He cried out a single word before his screams ended, and that word was Paija. It was hours before anyone dared venture abroad in the winter nights, and her single track. Oops, thought I advanced the page, but I didn't. It was hours before anyone dared venture out to see what had happened. Then a brother of Jatu, who wore an amulet belt and was something of a shaman, took his spear and went out into the night. He found Jatu standing by his sled, The snow was drifting steadily so that it was already risen above Jatu's knees, and he was dead, frozen solidly there. Yet he still stood, and his open eyes stared into the smoke of the drifts, and in his eyes was the image of Paija. So the brother of Jatu came as close as any man ever has to seeing Paija and remained alive, and he saw only the horror reflected in the eyes of the dead man in the snow. This is a well-known story, and both Jatu and his brother were well-known men along the river where I heard this tale. Paija is the most feared of all devils, yet she is but one among many. Another of these unpleasant beings is a troll with a huge and hairless belly which drags on the ground. The tips of the devil's fingers are armed with wicked knives which grow from the flesh. He is said to lie in wait for men in the high hills of the land, and to tear the flesh from the body of a victim with such exquisite deliberation that the victim lives for many hours. Another, called Wendigo, not Wendigo, there's no D in it. Maybe, hmm, actually, maybe it is the same. There's no D in it, like maybe it's because Wendigo is the name of a monster in the Indian tradition in the forest, but Wendigo is one of the Hamuatone devils. It is a notorious cannibal who haunts the forest. Wendigo is also known to the Northern Indians, and he is the most feared spirit in their land, where he is called Wendigo. Yeah, there's the D. There is no doubt that these two devils are one and the same, and this is very interesting, for it illustrates one of the many affinities between the culture of the Indians and the Yahamut, who are blood enemies of each other. These three unpleasant demons, like dozens of others in this group, serve a useful purpose. Wendigo was a very powerful influence in dissuading the Yahamut from venturing deeply into the timbered areas, where they might have been massacred by the Idthan Eldeli. Paija keeps men from making unnecessary journeys in the winter darkness when the blizzards are awake, and this is a good thing, for many men have not returned from such dangerous journeys. As for the troll in the hills, he too acts as a deterrent to those who would try to penetrate the dangerous rock heaps where he lives. Yeah. It makes me think of stories that are often told to children to appear to their emotions in fear in order to prevent them from doing bad things. First that pops to mind is the idea of Santa bringing coal to bad children, and the idea of getting a gift that just is only capable of heating you by firelight in the cold, and I suppose of also contributing to climate change. Not that that would, well, maybe it would frighten children. Sometimes they're more devoted to justice and nature than adults are, but also sometimes disconnected from the seriousness of the adult concerns. His value was demonstrated to me once when I took Utek with me for a trip into the ghost hills near Windy Bay. Utek was loath to go, but rather than admit his fear, he came along. We made progress only with the most heartbreaking efforts, for the overburden of immense glacial rocks was so heavy that horizontal travel is worse than mountain climbing. We leaped from rock to rock, and even with rubber-soled boots, I took several painful tumbles. Utak had deerskin kamiks on his feet, which gave no grip at all on the smooth and moss-encrusted stone. After 2 hours, in which we had gone only 3 miles, Utek slipped and caught his leg between two rocks. He did not cry out with pain, but tears were in his eyes when I reached him, and he could hardly bear to stand. With Utek limping painfully, supporting himself with a rifle for a crutch, it took us 7 hours to retrace our path. Had he been alone, Utek would still be in that vicious labyrinth of scattered rocks, and the troll might well have claimed another victim. As it was, and with all the help I could give him, he barely made it to the shore of Windy River without collapsing, and all he was suffering from was a badly bruised ankle. whether they exist or not, and I will not argue the point. The demons do represent manifestations of real and potential evils, and so they are not without value. The second of my arbitrary groups includes those unpredictable spirits who may be benevolent, neutral, or actively evil, more or less as the mood strikes them. One of these, the most interesting, is Apopa. Apopa is the Puck of the Barrens, a little dwarf devil shaped like a man, but grossly deformed. He plays malicious tricks on the people, but not all of his trickery is completely objectionable, and so the Aham would regard him with tolerance unless he carries his jokes a little too far. The trick Apopa played on me is still something of a puzzle. One afternoon in the fall of my second year in the country, Andy and I were still sitting quietly in the cabin at Windy Bay, drinking tea and chatting. Then, without warning, the little shack was violently shaken, much as a rat is shaken in the jaws of an angry dog. We both jumped to our feet and rushed out of doors, certain that an earthquake had struck us. But as we stood on the bank of the river, we could see nothing amiss. A small herd of deer rested contentedly by the far shore, and the September day was drowsy and quiet. Baffled and a little uneasy, we went back to our tea, but we had barely seated ourselves when the shaking was repeated. Tin mugs bounced off the table, and stretching boards fell with a great clatter from the rafters. This time we were thoroughly excited. Once again, we ran outside, and again we could find nothing to explain the sudden vibrations in the cabin. Some of them would have come down from a visit, were camped near at hand, and in search of an explanation of the strange tremors, I walked up to their tents and described what had happened. They looked at me quite blankly and showed no signs of comprehension. In some exasperation, I asked if they had not felt the vibrations too, and I even suggested that they were playing a trick on the white men. They only looked more puzzled than ever. Then Ahoto brightened a little. Kakami is camped just over the hill, he said. Perhaps he will know what happened, for it sounds like the work of a devil. And went on to Kakami's tent, and when I put my question to him, he answered at once, almost as if he had been expecting my visit and knew its reason. It was Apopa, he told me. Apopa, the mischievous one. He flew over this place, for I saw the air shake as he passed, and so I knew he was near. No doubt he glanced down at Yerglou and saw two Cablonnais drinking their tea. Apopa would laugh to see such a ludicrous thing, for his sense of humor is keen. So you see, when he laughed, he shook the walls and the floor, and that is what you felt. That was that. The matter was settled. And Inu had paid no more attention to it, except to chuckle a little at the exquisite sense of humor of Apopa, who was so uproariously amused by the mere sight of white men. Well, I suppose that Apopa too has his value, for a sense of humor is a hard thing to retain in that land. Apart from Apopa and one or two other particular devils, there is one large group in my second category of spirits that can be collectively referred to as the Inua. They comprise not only the actual ghosts of the dead men, but also, to some extent, the spirits of such inanimate objects as rivers, rocks, and plants. The Inua come in two sizes: Inua Mikikuni, the little ghosts, and Inua Ag Ankuni, the great ghosts. Inua of both sizes vary from actively hostile to active benevolence toward men. The dangerous Inua are those who come from the land of the dead because of failure to give them proper burial, because of some crime they have done, or because of evil which was in their hearts when they died. Hmm. These spirits are not content to remain in the land of the dead. Instead, they return to pass through the lands of the living, and they may come in the actual guise of a man. They are fond of the rough hill country, and so are another good reason for giving that rocky country in the hills a wide berth. However, they do not restrict themselves to the hills, but may come wandering over the plains in search of a living being whom, by treachery or through terror, they can possess and thus manage to return fully into the land of the living. Can't remember the name of it, but I can think of very great, if you can consider anything in that genre great, a great horror movie about, or more than one, I guess, of in America, demonic possession and the slow process of fear and doubt that's necessary to wear down a human being before an evil spirit can possess them. Yeah, I think it's the great Netflix version of House on the book, A House on Haunted Hill, which was called The Haunting of Hill House, and only tangentially related to the book. But I think there's also a movie. The Netflix show is a miniseries. Um, One of the most vivid experiences in the Barrens was when an Innu, the singular of Inua, chose to attack my song cousin Utek. Here's the story just as it happened. I did not see the Innu myself, nevertheless, I am convinced that as far as Utek was concerned, this Innu existed in an unpleasantly material sense. Again, the incident took place at Windy Cabin, but this time in June, when there are no nights, but only the coming and going of twilight. It was very late, and I was trying to catch up on my notes while Andy was occupied with some little task at the back of the cabin. Utek was staying with us, and this evening he was busy carving a new pipe from a piece of black spruce. Casually, everything starts casually. It's all fun and games until somebody gets hurt. Sorry, I'm thinking ahead. Casually, Utek glanced up at the window to see if the moon had risen yet. What he actually saw caused him to explode into a perfect frenzy of terror. He shrieked like a woman in childbirth, leaped to his feet, and shot out of the door of the cabin. Andy and I were both so startled by this inexplicable eruption of our midnight quiet that it was some time before we could get up steam enough to see what had happened to Utek. When we did move, we found him standing near the doorstep, gibbering wildly and staring at the slopes of the Ghost Hills. He tried to tell us what he had seen, but nothing came from his mouth except garbled noises and a thin trickle of saliva that ran down his trembling chin. Andy pulled him into the cabin while I had a look around, a cocked rifle in my hands. Nothing moved except for a flock of late ducks which came whistling down the river. When I went in, Utek was squatting on the floor. He had recovered some of his self control and was able to make us understand that he had seen an Innu wearing complete winter clothing that had fixed Utek with the eyes of a dead man. Now Utek was certain that this spirit had determined to possess him, and he was not unnaturally terrified at the prospect. We told him he had seen no more than the flicker of wings as a late bird went by the window, but Utek would have none of it. At length it became obvious to us that this was no imaginary terror which gripped him, so we changed our tactics, and I offered to mix up a particularly powerful kabluna potion that would keep the Innu away. Utek's gratitude was pathetic. I went to the table, poured some harmless chemicals into a vial, then added a scrap of paper on which I had written, with my usual lack of imagination, the first line of God Save the King. When I brought it to Utek, Andy had just finished giving the Eskimo a rough physical examination. He told me with a worried note in his voice that Utek's pulse was nearly twice as fast as it should be. In addition, the Eskimo was sweating so heavily that his clothing was soaked. He seemed to have all the symptoms of severe physical shock, even to a shortness of breath. I handed him the vial, and he grasped it with a pitiful eagerness, but the reaction was hardly what we had hoped for. His eyes suddenly rolled up until the pupils were hidden. He gasped once, fell over on his side, and his limbs kicked uncontrollably while his breathing seemed to stop completely and his lips turned blue. At this point, I suspect we were sweating as freely as Utek, for we were not looking forward to explaining the presence of his corpse to his friends when next they visited our camp. And a corpse he would certainly have become had not Andy acted on pure intuition, pried open the clenched jaws to find that Utek had literally swallowed his tongue. My friend had got his hand bitten, but he managed to crook a finger around the tongue and restore it to its proper position. It was bad luck for the Innu who had come within an ace of finishing Utek completely. Utek recovered quickly after that. He was almost normal again in an hour, for his faith and charm we had given him was boundless despite its first effects. Later on, I asked him if he had ever had a seizure like this before, since I suspected it might have been some sort of epileptic fit, but he swore that this was the first, and he intimated that he would be quite happy if it was also the last. I have no doubt his condition was simply one of severe shock brought on by a serious fright. By an Innu? Well, whether it was a bona fide ghost or not, its effects were only too real. Hmm. Yeah, the power of the imagination is. Yeah, because fear is kind of a dark cousin to sexuality, and it makes me think of the line that the imagination is the greatest erogenous zone. Utek sewed our vial into his amulet belt, where it hung as a mute reproach to me during the rest of my time in the country, for I, who take a dim view of people who perpetrate superstitious humbug on the natives, was now guilty of the same crime. Yeah, people differ on that. There's some people that feel like if you can cure somebody by genuine belief and the power of the mind is incredible, then it's a real cure, and it's not hogwash, it's not trickery. It's one of the intentional and well used by theatricality traits of, as far as I've learned, native medicines, shamans. Not that Kakami would, we've seen portrayed in this, had people's well-being very much in mind. The amulet belt brings me to the last of my three groups of spirits. These include the Tornrate, whom we have met earlier, and who are the chief aids of men in their struggles with the elements and the unfriendly devils, and a lesser breed of good spirits who have no inclusive name and who are perhaps better described simply as forces rather than supernatural entities. These latter beings are attached to a man by virtue of an amulet he has acquired, preferably in his youth. When a child is born, his parents at once attempt to enlist certain animal forces to aid him through life. The amulets, or tokens of the chosen spirit, should preferably be, quote, things of the earth, unquote. Hmm. Thus, even small insects are believed to be efficacious, for they come from the earth. Beetles and bugs are thought to have a specific value as defenses against the more gruesome trolls and dwarfs who live under the ground. Amongst the other charms worn at the amulet belt are the talons and beaks of birds, the dried skins of small mammals such as weasels and lemmings, the teeth and the ears of larger mammals such as wolves and foxes, and in some cases even the scales of fish. I should add that man does not necessarily acquire the physical attributes of these things. A weasel tapek, or charm, for instance, does not endow the owner with the strength or speed of the weasel, but acts instead as a specific deterrent against some form of evil. Halo, one of the Helmut who claims rather extensive supernatural favors, wears a miniature parka and a pair of tiny comics on his amulet belt, and these ensure him against accidental death from freezing or drowning. Hmm. It is best for the owner to acquire amulets by purchase or as gifts. Hmm. Interesting. The more distant their source, the greater their power. Halo purchased a seal tooth amulet from the Padlimuit to the east, and they in turn had obtained it from the Diomuit on the coast. Let me spell those just for the heck of it. Padliemuit, the Muit. Some memories of associating them with coastal Eskimos, and Dhaeomuit. Not now that I think about it, the inland Eskimos would have had a written language. These words must have all been given spellings by Moet. Hmm. The tooth came a long way, gaining power as it came, and it its ultimate purchase price when Hela bought it was one new kayak. The value of a good amulet is not insignificant. Properly connected with the amulets are the particular taboos. Hmm, it's not spelled like it's not Taboo. It's Tabus. Different meaning apparently. Uh, taboos called Pewhuit. Sorry, Pewhitu. Pewhitu. It's italicized, unlike those other two words I spelled. These taboos are laid on a child at birth, and they usually forbid him some specific form of food, or they may forbid him to kill a certain species of animal. Thus, Ahoto is forbidden to eat the flesh of the great northern pike, and Utilek may not shoot nor eat a loon. Hikwa must never touch the liver of deer, and Tablu must not kill a lemming. The penalty for such disobedience is the possibility that the lawbreaker may become an Ino after death. The practical value of these taboos is purely disciplinary, as are many of our religious prohibitions. Yeah. Just the belief that something is important. It gives a certain kind of focus and clarity to living, something that you should not do. Although there's another fascinating book on Daniel Quinn's recommended reading list called um, Cows, Pigs, Wars, and Witches, The Riddles of Culture, talking about how many of the usually civilized cultures, but the seemingly bizarre and pointless um, rules of certain cultures do actually have a rational historical or biological basis when you look deeper into it. I can think of one of my thinking of is no pork, pig meat in certain parts of the Middle East, and it's quite sensibly traced to in a desert culture with the preciousness of water and how toxic pig poop is and how destructive pigs can be. The active raising of lots of them would be incredibly dangerous to the water supply. Hmm. As for Tornray, they are not to be acquired so easily as are the amulet spirits, for they are the most powerful forces for good in the barrens. They are positive beings who not only defend their owners, or rather their friends, from evil, but who can attack actively and accomplish great things. Tornright may be acquired in a variety of ways, although usually a man must seek them out by enduring physical hardship. So the shamans expose themselves to the weather, to hunger and thirst until they fall into a trance. Then and then only the really great Tornright appear, and a struggle between the wills of the man and of a particular Tornrack ensues. If the man wins, he secures the lifetime services of that Tornrack. If he loses, he seldom returns from his ordeal. You should bring up again that story that I mentioned in a previous chapter about me, that strange night of courage walking through the college woods in Durham, New Hampshire in the complete dark, calling out to the darkness for what it was I was afraid of to come face me. And in a way, I was enduring some kind of hardship, but probably not in a way that would have earned the respect of the equivalent of a torn rate or a torn rack. It's hard to say, and why I felt possibly a little bit ashamed afterward of the arrogance that I was behaving possibly with from their point of view, if there were any. Mm. The lesser torn ray may be encountered quite by accident, though. Thus it happened that when Hana was out hunting one day, he met what he believed to be a demon. He describes it as a rather squat animal thing with immense hairs on its snout and with a single paw that extended half the length of its body. This apparition attacked Hannah, who bravely flung down his bow and grappled with the monstrous thing. After the exhausting fight, the Tornrack, for such it was, gave up the struggle and even ever afterwards served as the personal Tornrack of Hannah, to the man's great advantage. I suppose I should note Hanna, possibly with an H as an end, is generally a woman's name to us, but this is Hannah with one N. There is a revealing sidelight both on the torn rate and on the minds of the Hamlet, in the relationship maintained between the helping spirits of men. If it happens, as it sometimes does, that a torn rack is incapable of assisting its friend, then the man assumes that the spirit is simply bone lazy, and with no further nonsense, he sends it packing, and the fallible spirit goes weeping off into the plains out of a job. Hmm. Also, thinking back on the chapter about Kakumi, and because it seems as though what maybe is a little bit surprising is that Moet and Kakumi described the devil that Kakumi wrestled as a torn rack. Although I guess now that I'm thinking about it, later Moet referred to it as a devil and not really a torn rack. Suppose you could argue that it was a devil masquerading as a torn rack, perhaps. Hmm. It is impossible to talk about the Ihamoid spirits and devils without also talking about the shamans. These dedicated men are the chief physical defense of the people against evil spirits, and so they must be particularly strong and well armed. As an almost invariable rule, they are the most intelligent men of each generation, and so they supply whatever nebulous leadership is present in the Ihamoid society. They are not sorcerers, as many missionaries would have us believe, for, at least in the Ihamoid country, Kakumi excepted, they work no evil, but concentrate on assisting the people for the people's own good, and they make few extravagant claims. Hmm. Once again, the lack of ego, narcissism, arrogance, sociopathy, psychopathy. They do not say they can provide good hunting, for the Hamlet believe all animals have the gift of free will, and neither the wishes of men nor those of gods will influence the movements of beasts. Nor do the shamans claim to be able to control the weather, for this is Kaila's province, and Kaila does not listen patiently to the begging voices of men. However, the shamans can and do assist men with particular problems. By passing into a trance and conferring with their torn rate, the shamans can give advice on whether or not a dangerous winter trip should be attempted. They can often relieve a man of a mysterious illness, and they can advise on all manner of domestic and practical problems. Things are their strength, for by virtue of their experience and intelligence, they can materially assist their people, whether or not they do it by supernatural means. At the same time, they are seldom so all powerful that they come to stand head and shoulders above the rest of the Hamlet. A man who is too efficient or too powerful is not liked by the Inuit, and this applies even to shamans who exist to serve men, not to control them. Hmm. Hmm. It's interesting because we seem to want our leaders to be quote unquote too powerful. Witness how easily people fell for Donald Trump's baloney. The strong man shouting at the top of his lungs that only he can fix it. Hmm. Hmm. The shaman's trance provides the psychological background essential to any religion and is sometimes a formidable thing to behold, even if the onlooker is white and skeptical. There is a minimum of mummery and stage setting. While the people sit in a circle about the floor of a tent, a shaman may take his drum and with half closed eyes shuffle about singing a song in the ancient shaman language. The audience carries the chant, as in a drum dance, but much more softly. At last there is a break in the drumming, and the shaman collapses in a heap on the floor, and a palpable silence ensues for some minutes. Then voices may be heard. The voice of the shaman is followed by the voice of his tornrag, a strange and eerie sound which, so it seems, could not come from the throat of a man. The awakening is sometimes exceedingly violent and exciting. The shaman may leap to his feet and be possessed with a quite inexplicable physical strength. Half a dozen men may not be able to hold him at all, and he may break through the wall of the tent and disappear into the darkness to come back streaming with blood and in the last stages of exhaustion. In the aftergrip of the trance, a shaman may do himself bodily harm, which would be fatal to an ordinary man, yet he invariably recovers from such self inflicted wounds. But awakenings are not usually so bloody and violent. In most cases, the shaman returns to his life quietly and as quietly tells his audience that he has seen and heard. If there has been trouble in the camp, the shaman may say his Tornrak has told him that someone has broken a taboo. And there ensues a mass confession. All the onlookers confess their sins and so ease their consciences. Makes me think of the solitary confessionals in Catholicism. But once again, the values of community as opposed to individuality for us. I also find myself thinking it's a little side story that reminds me of shaman behavior. The closest I've ever come to witnessing anything like that is when I witnessed an ex-girlfriend of mine, Michelle, and I split an hour with a channeler. It was an old woman, kind of eccentric but neat, and she claimed to channel a spirit named Sir Garad, and spoke in a different voice, quite different. Um, and there was a recording machine that was supposed to record the whole session, but tragically the audio was terrible, and I wasn't able to hear any of it when I tried to play it back, despite how fascinating it was. The main thing I remember is Sergorod's claim that this reality is an experiment in the illusion of duality. So, things aren't so simple as black and white. Everything is interconnected. And I often try to emphasize the interconnectedness of things with tangents like this. Anyway, the physical relation I was meaning to bring up centrally was that during the entire trance, she held her arms completely straight and upraised, which seems like it would get very tiring, but it didn't bother her at all. And I think I asked her at one point, or asked him, why that, and she joked, because of the wonderful smell, because she was exposing her armpits. I think she had very short sleeve shirts. Anyway, back to the book. Certain individual shamans are gifted with unusual powers. One of these is a young man, 19 or 20 years old, who once was of the hamlet, but who now lives near the coast. He is a shaman of note, for he has the hypnotic ability to fill the tent where a seance is being held with deer, wolves, bears, and even seagoing beasts such as a walrus and seals. On occasion, he has conjured up such a menagerie that the audience has been crowded right out. It happens that there is an independent trader who lives near this Eskimo camp, and one day this trader made the tactical error of doubting the shaman's ability when the young man was visiting the post. Quick as a wink, the young Eskimo conjured up the formidable steel prow of the mission ship Stella Polaris and brought it crashing through the wall of the cabin with such ferocious realism that the trader fled for his life, yelping with fright. Okay, just because this is awesome, I'm going to assume that's true. This tale is told with great gusto and joy by the Dahelmuit, but unfortunately I didn't witness it for myself. However, I did watch Kakami at work on one of the other tasks of a shaman, the chasing away of an evil spirit. Oh, he actually tried to chase away something evil instead of encouraging it. Interesting. Complicated character. Again, it was a summer night when we were visited by an Ino, but this time the incident took place while we were entertaining Kakami and some of the other Hamlet in our tent out on the barrens. I never discovered just who saw what before our quiet evening of gossip was interrupted by a startled rush of all the Eskimos, except Kakami, for cover under bedrolls, blankets, and anything else that could be found in the tent. By then, Andy and I had grown moderately used to such erratic behavior, and we could observe what happened without the distraction of being thrown into a flap ourselves. Kakami stood his ground in the middle of the tent and stared at the doorway, mumbling like an old dog that catches the scent of a wolf. The others trembled visibly, at least the parts of them which were exposed trembled visibly, and so we assumed another ghost was in the vicinity. The first shock wore off almost at once, and the fugitives crawled out from cover, looking both sheepish and scared. Kakami now sat them in a circle about them, and he went from one to the other, holding out his outstretched hand. Each man gave the shaman some small object, a pinch of tobacco, an empty brass shell case, or a match. We contributed a pinch of sugar and a 22 bullet. Kakami now squatted on his hams and spread the gifts out under his parka skirts, then stood up to reveal that the object had vanished. It was a simple conjuring and not very effective, but it was obviously only part of the ritual which was to be undergone before the shaman could get down to serious work. Kakami's next step was to borrow a rifle from me and make a great show of loading it with an empty shell. Then he closed the breech, stepped to the door, pointed the gun into the darkness, and pressed the trigger. The Eskimos knew it was coming, but we didn't, and the blast of a very live shell caused us to leap several inches into the air to the great satisfaction of Kakami and the other Helmwood. This ended the preparatory part of the show. Kakami now drew his knife, a long, ugly weapon, and stepped outside. He was gone for a good half hour. Occasionally we could hear him muttering in an incomprehensible jargon. At last he returned and calmly announced that he had met two Inua, not just one, and had done them to death, killing one with a knife and strangling the other. There was great jubilation, but somehow the whole affair didn't seem to ring true. It was a good enough show, but it lacked telling effect. Some weeks later, Ahoto admitted it was all a put-up job to satisfy the curiosity of the white men. As Ahoto told me, it would not do to fool about with a real visitation simply for our amusement, so the Eskimos had thoughtfully provided a synthetic example of ghost hunting which would show us the ropes but involve no one in danger. The tools of the shaman are simple almost to the point of non-existence. He has a staff, a short club-like length of wood with a tapek tied to its middle, and he has something that is known to native races all over the world. Scientists call it a bull roarer, and the Aham would call it a memio. It is an oval blade of thin wood with notched edges and a cord tied to one end. Rolled rapidly over one's head, it gives off a deep-throated, mumbling roar which has the quality of ventriloquism about it, for from a few yards away it is impossible to locate the source of the sound. It is used primarily in connection with the driving out of evil from the body of a man who is afflicted with illness or who has broken a serious taboo and feels himself in danger. Amongst the many Ihamo taboo are the laws which prohibit the making of skin clothing when there is no snow on the ground, a prohibition against working with iron after a thunderstorm, the law which says no food may be eaten for 24 hours after a ghost has been seen, and numerous taboos covering the activities of a pregnant woman and governing the conduct in the camps when a death has occurred. A surprising number of these are apparently senseless restrictions, have a sensible basis in reality, and are not simply rituals of the supernatural. One particularly valuable possession of the Ihamwood is a stock of potent spirit songs called Iringelo, which are passed down from parent to child, and their ownership is jealously guarded, though they may be used to aid any man in the camps. Most of them are specifics to aid in the cure of certain ailments believed to be caused by ghosts of evil intent towards man. On one of my many trips with Utek out into the barrens, I developed severe cramps in my stomach and became deathly sick. I was afraid of appendicitis, but there was nothing I could do to help myself except lie quietly in my tent and try not to groan with pain. Utek was concerned. He brought me hot tea every few minutes and constantly inquired how I was feeling. Yet he seemed preoccupied and shy. It was only after some hours of indecision that Utek could finally bring himself to speak to the point which was bothering him. Then, very tentatively, he asked me if he could try the effect of his own personal Iringello for stomach ailments on me. He had hesitated because he was afraid I would scorn his offer, being a white man and thereafter master of superior charms. Actually, I had no faith in his charm, but I did not wish to repulse his kindness, and so I told him that I would be grateful. He took a tin cup filled with fresh water and, holding it carefully in front of him, began to walk slowly around the outside of the tent where I lay. As he walked, he sang his Iringello, a monotonous dirge in a minor key. At intervals, he ceased singing and addressed himself to the cup of water, urging the evil to leave me and the good to come in. All this was continued for perhaps 5 or 10 minutes. Then Utek returned to the tent, gave me the water, and told me to swallow it down. Though I was sick, I could see that he was almost abjectly afraid that I would laugh or toss the water away. He wanted very greatly to help me, but he was also deeply afraid that he was being exposed, both exposing himself and his beliefs to my ridicule. Well, I took the water and, with all proper solemnity, drank it and was at once seized by a violent urge to urinate. I barely got out of the tent in time, and the urine was so hot and painful I was almost convinced Utek had added some irritant to the water. Still, I had not seen him do it, and anyway, I could not understand how any irritant would have functioned so quickly. While I was engrossed in this problem, and with the burning in my loins, it suddenly dawned on me that my belly pains had vanished. Utek was standing, watching me from the door, with a strained smile on his face. Hmm. I gave him an answering grin, and he promptly beamed like an idiot and rushed off to cook me some supper. Hmm. Hmm. Sounds like imagination and the placebo effect wasn't at work there in Moet. Certainly seems like he didn't believe in it. Hmm. I suppose it was just a happy coincidence, for it is certainly not faith that cured me, not mine at any rate. When I thanked Utek for his aid, I also asked him what had happened, and he replied with beautiful simplicity that the good had come in with the water and the bad had gone out with the water. Later that day, he again showed me the half furtive attitude which had preceded my cure. This time I asked him what was the trouble, and he sheepishly told me I must on no account shoot any deer for 5 days, or I would myself experience the same agony as a deer that had been shot in the belly. Fortunately, no need to kill a deer arose during the next 5 days, and I did not feel much like putting Utek's injunction needlessly to the test. Hmm. Now, in this chapter, I have hardly begun to delve into the spiritual beliefs of the Hamlet. There was a great deal more, and the whole forms a closely knit pattern which is intricately entwined with the everyday life of the people. What I have told you, seen out of context by the eyes of strangers and skeptical ones, may understandably have given the impression that the beliefs of the Baron's people form an incubus that overshadows their lives. But at no time did I feel they were haunted by devils and spirits, the products of their primitive minds. The closer I came to understanding and to a unity with the people, the more idiotic such rational conclusions would have become. It must also always be remembered that the people are of their world and know nothing of us and ours, and so that what seems like gross unreality to us can remain unassailably real to them. Their beliefs are a product of long centuries, and they fit the needs of their life and the shape of the land they live in. They believe. That is the point. And it is a point we seldom consider when we decide to force our religions upon native peoples. I knew an old white trapper who once lived in Southampton Island in the heart of the Arctic. He is dead now and probably rotting in hell, but I recall a remark of his when the question of converting the Eskimos to our religion was being discussed. God damn it, he cried with quite unconscious blasphemy. What the hell good do these sky pilots do anyhow? First they smash up the Huskies' religion, then they feed them a damn great book that we've been arguing and fighting over for about 2,000 years. And what's the result? Why, the poor buggers wind up hanging on to the worst of their heathen beliefs mixed up with the worst part of ours, and the outcome is they don't believe nothing at all and understand less. Perhaps my foul-mouthed old friend has no right to be heard on the matter of religion, but I think the Eskimos themselves have that right. Here's what a coast Eskimo said of our religion after he had spent a week under the ardent tutelage of a missionary. The remarks were made in an honest, if puzzled spirit to the local trader, an intelligent man in sympathy with the natives. Before this, I should advocate that if you haven't seen it, you should watch the movie Black Robe, which came out about the same time as Dances with Wolves, and shows much more genuine understanding of native peoples, and less idealism, the fantasy of the noble savage than Dances with Wolves showed. What a life you must people lead. What a life you must lead. The Equala, the priest, has spoken to me for hours of the things you believe. Oh, not a good start. I think I'm choking on God like this native must be. Sorry, let's start that paragraph a third time. What a life you must lead. The Equala, the priest, has spoken to me for hours of the things you believe. Your God, these devils with wings, these ghosts and spirits who live in the sky and under the ground. Truly, I am amazed and afraid. It must be only because you are a white man and gifted with great strength and wealth that you can survive all these terrors your beliefs put upon you. These laws of your gods take no heeds of the hearts of their people. These devils and spirits who watch each thing you do and judge you by terrible standards of death. These things make me shudder with horror. Yet though I am afraid of these things, I can be sorry for you who must live under such shadows. For you are also the sons of the woman and the brothers of the Inuit. I wish you well in your struggles to escape from the place you call hell. The trader remembered that conversation in detail. He was not particularly pleased to find himself pitied by a heathen. If you feel that neither the pagan Eskimo nor the heretical trapper has any right to be heard, then you can at least listen to the words of a missionary who represents a great, very great faith and who spent 52 years of his life in the midst of an Indian people who were pagan when he first arrived. I came to know him well, to respect him and feel a great fondness for him, since he was, above all things, an upright man and an honest man, and he worked as I have never seen any man work for the glory of God and of his church. When I knew him, his life was near its end, and he died a few months after I left his little settlement. He had labored hard, with love, with belief, and with severity, to accomplish his task. Now the task was done. All the Indians in his area came regularly to the church and called themselves Christian. But in the 50-odd years when he was the real power in the land, the old man watched a virile tribe. I almost said virulent. Christianity in my subconscious. A virile tribe of nearly 3,000 people shrank to a passionless remnant of less than 200. Those who remained were lazy, shiftless, mentally and physically disabled men and women who lived in squalor and died in filth. Again, if I'm thinking about that movie Black Robe, there's a scene very much like that when the main character is a priest from France who is trying to come and replace the priest in a French mission in about the time of Samuel de Champlain, and he arrives to find something like that 200 remnant, passionless, and so much so that they were the end note of the movie is that they were very quickly wiped out by their neighbors, neighboring tribes, who as is normal with tribes, is they periodically test the strength of each other with erratic retaliator strategy, like I mentioned from my Ishmael, just so everybody's always reminding everybody else that they're still there and they're still strong. They're not pushovers, and Christianity was part of what turned them into pushovers. Disease was part of it too, but it's turning the other cheek, like Jesus said, is not the best idea in that kind of environment. His task was done. On a midnight just before the celebration of Christmas, I was sitting in his little log home. Our talk had come to an end. The old man stared past me out of the dark windows, and down his cheeks that had been tortured by frost and wizened by sun over the long painful years of his labors, tears fell slowly. The silence was a palpable thing, and I was desperately uncomfortable. Earlier that evening, I had come to his house with a bitter anger against him in my heart, having spent their day in a hog pen of the people of the place, and having heard some tales that I did not care to repeat. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, worth bringing up here. Not that there aren't roads less bad than that one that are also paved with good intentions, nevertheless still bad. You don't have to go all the way head to hell, you can just go part of the way there. I had spoken bluntly and cruelly to the old man, and I had been both unfair and thoughtless. Yet he had not reproached me. He had not flung texts in my face and sent me away. He had listened quietly to my angry words of condemnation, and when I was done, he had talked, ramblingly and without evident purpose, of his life in the land. He had spoken, using an old man's disconnected words, of the memories of his long life. Then he had ceased talking, and now he wept. I wanted to leave, for I felt sick with shame at what I thought I had done by my violent attack on the works of his years, but before I could go, his voice came stealthily back into the room. It was soft, yet older than any voice I have ever heard. "It was better, then?" he asked gently. "It was better that I had not come to this place, that these people I loved had not heard my voice, and I had never come? You think that? And I? What do I think? I think sometimes that it was a bad thing for these people when I was sent to this place." I left him then, left the old man with the reward of a lifetime of labor. Age and the sure face of death had left him no need to lie to himself or to me. Yet I wished desperately that he had lied, and that I had aided and abetted his lie. Can't finish that chapter without bringing up the death of Ivan Ilyich again. Well, good night, everybody. It's the death of my long day. Reborn into another tomorrow.